thank you so much for joining us. My name is Natalie Walker, and I'm the manager of college operations here at the Classic Learning Test. For anyone unfamiliar with the CLT, we are a college entrance exam and assessment suite for grades 7 through 12. One thing that distinguishes the CLT as a test is its content. 2/3 of the passages on any CLT exam come from our author bank. This is a list comprised of men and women who have contributed to the richness of philosophy and thought that we have inherited. They're authors you're likely to encounter in your college career, and hopefully you'll engage with them throughout your life. So most Thursdays of the academic year, to help us develop a true common canon, a faculty member from one of our partner colleges helps us explore one author from the CLT bank. Our author tonight, Equiano, is, I believe, the most recent addition to the author bank, thanks to our board of academic advisors. And our partner college tonight is Toccoa Falls College, which sits on 1,100 acres in the rural foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains and is home to the historic Toccoa Falls waterfall at 186 feet. It's the tallest free-falling waterfall east of the Mississippi. In that landscape, TFC uniquely integrates biblical truth, academic excellence, and intentional spiritual formation within a caring Christian community. We'll ask our guest tonight more about the college at the end of the hour. That guest is Dr. Stephen Petersheim, who received his PhD in English from Baylor University, where he taught in the English and honors programs. Upon graduation, he became a professor at Indiana University East, where he taught American literature and introductory creative writing and directed the honors program. A Fulbright scholar in Belarus in 2017, Dr. Petersheim took his family to Eastern Europe for a semester of intercultural dialogue and learning, traipsing about the country and through castles built over 1,000 years ago. Following his time in Belarus and Indiana, Dr. Petersheim enrolled in seminary in Massachusetts and received his MDiv from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, combining his theological and literary interests as an adjunct professor at Gordon College before moving south to a small liberal arts Christian college in the shadow of the mountains of North Georgia. There will be time after the lecture for questions, so keep your questions close and I will be fielding those from the chat afterwards. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Petersheim. We're so grateful you're here. And the screen is yours.
Yes, thank you for having me here. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So I hope you can see this. Yes, good. So on here, first of all, I'm delighted that the CLT has added Equiano here. I think it's a much needed addition, and I really have come to love Equiano's autobiography, which is the main thing we'll be talking about tonight, of course. But Olaudah Equiano, born in 1745 and died in 1797. So we're going back a few centuries into the 18th century, sort of the Enlightenment era. And we'll see sort of his travels, that he's in some ways an international figure as well. But I'm going to take us through sort of 5 steps this evening. The timeline of his life, first of all, talk about the slave narrative genre, which is really what he is writing in that genre. We'll talk about what that means. It is a kind of autobiography, and we'll go through his actual slave narrative, his autobiography. It's 12 chapters. I'm going to give you excerpts of it so we can look at that together and think about his experiences as a slave. And as a free man, because he's not a slave for the entire narrative. And so and then I'll sort of close it up with questions that are raised by him, and then sort of his letter to Parliament that he later prefaced the later editions of his work with, a letter to Parliament. He joined with Wilberforce and others in England who were advocating for abolition, for the end of slavery. So this is briefly who he is. This is the most famous picture of him, the frontispiece in the slave narrative in his autobiography. So I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But for the timeline, there we go. So, okay, for the timeline here, we have, again, in 1745, he's born in Osaka, in what was then the Kingdom of Benin, which is not in the present-day country of Benin, but rather in the present-day country of Nigeria. Benin was one of the larger kingdoms of that area of Africa. Next to Ethiopia might have been the largest sort of kingdom in the period when Africa was not yet colonized. So that would have been sort of his background in that area. And then in 1753, he's kidnapped and enslaved and taken to the West Indies. I'll fill you in on more of the details a little later. But then, and then to Virginia. So he's taken all the way across to the United States, or at that point, the colonies. And then he's bought by a British sea captain who takes him back to England with him. And in England, he is actually given a lot of freedom while he's not needed by the sea captain. And he actually goes to school and is baptized at St. Margaret's Church in London in 1759. So he's doing school, and he has his godmother there. The woman who stands in for his godmother is one of his teachers, and she has a huge influence on his life. And then 1766, so again, part of the time he's in England, part of the times he's going to see, there's a lot of the English fighting the French, so he's in some of those battles, but then also his owner takes them down to the West Indies quite a bit, so the Caribbean islands and close to South America or Central America there. But he goes back and forth. In 1766, though, he's able to buy his own freedom, and then he becomes an outspoken abolitionist speaker. And at one point, he's a commissary to Sierra Leone, which is actually an attempt to make a way for Africans who have been enslaved to return to Africa. Of course, there's complications with that whole situation that he's part of as well, and I'll talk a little more about that a little later. But he is a commissioner on the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor, trying to create a good situation for Africans who wanted to go back to Africa. Of course, not all of them are from Sierra Leone, and so it's an attempt that works for some and not so much for others. 1789, at the encouragement of a number of people, he publishes his autobiography, The Interesting Narrative, that we'll be looking at in just a moment. And in 1797, he dies in London. He doesn't live quite long enough to see the end of slavery, complete end of slavery in the British territories. But in 1807, so that's 10 years after his death, is actually when slavery ends in the whole slave trade and slavery in the British territories and everywhere. It had ended in England before that. So during his lifetime, if you lived in England, you couldn't have slaves. Slavery was stopped in England, but not in all their territories. And so he was really advocating to get rid of that, particularly in the West Indies, where he had been enslaved and had a number of really terrible experiences. So, and saw others who were also being oppressed in that area. So, very briefly, there's a lot on this page, so I'm going to just give it to you basically as for a sense of what the slave narrative is, and that it follows often a very specific pattern. You have the frontispiece, which is often an engraving of the author, and that's the same thing you have in Equiano. There's an engraving of him. Often that engraving is signed by the author himself. And then after that's the title page, and usually it ends with written by himself or something like that, written by herself in case of women writers. And so it ends with that as well, written by himself. And then inevitably it's followed by testimonials of whites who are attesting to the truth of his narrative. And they often talk about the plain truth. He's not elaborating, not adding anything to it, not coloring it in. He's just giving us the unvarnished truth it's spoken of. And the reason that's so important in slave narratives is because there are skeptical readers who are like, well, first of all, a slave could never write something like this. Secondly, whoever wrote this is probably making up things. But by having whites who were known people, known in the literary world, in the intellectual world, this kind of gave added credibility to the narrative, or took away that excuse for not believing it at least. And then there's usually a poetic epigraph. And for Equiano's narrative, he actually has the epigraph on the title page, and it is a selection from the song from Isaiah, the book of Isaiah from the Bible. And there's a heavy inflection of Christianity in this narrative, as there are in many slave narratives. The story itself, then there's 12 elements, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but most of these show up somewhere in Equiano's narrative. He doesn't begin with what becomes sort of the classic sentence of, I was born in Annapolis, or I was born in Florida, or wherever I was born. He doesn't begin with that, but he does tell us in that beginning where his childhood was. And so he does go through a lot of the things that are here. At the very end, then, usually is an appendix of slavery documents, often documents showing that particular slave had been enslaved by whoever, so the document of slavery, basically, and then also some anti-slavery literature attached at the end as well. It's a pretty common part of this. But again, this is something that James Olney had looked at in the 80s, and it has become sort of a standard for how do we understand the slave narrative? What are the parts of the slave narrative? How does it work? And this is a pretty, again, a pretty typical description of it. If you look at number 10 on here, you'll say successful escapes with the help of the North Star and Quakers in free states. And that's when it happens in the United States, which the majority of slave narratives are in the United States. So this one's a little bit outside the norm in that he is more English than American, really. And so that is one difference with his. But his becomes a model that a lot of slaves use in both the United States and elsewhere. The beginning of this, so the full title of his work is The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African, first published in 1789 in London. And for this, the title, the two names, his master gave him another name, Gustavus Vasa, the Italian or Latin name for that was given to him. But he continued to use his African name, and he actually used his African name for his baptism as well. So that's interesting to see that in the records. But this is him, and then we go to the chapters. There are 12 chapters in this work. He starts off, again, as I said earlier, with looking at his background, his childhood in Benin, the Kingdom of Benin at the time. Again, that would be present-day Nigeria, is where he actually was. Talks about that. And then he's kidnapped in chapter 2. He's kidnapped along with his sister by a neighboring tribe. And the problem with this is that he then becomes passed along from tribe to tribe, as he's not retrieved by his parents, by his own tribe or city, as we'll see. It's more of a city than a tribe, really. And so that is the unfortunate part of his story, but he's taken all the way to the coast and then sold to white slavers there. And he's first of all goes down to the West Indies briefly, but then he's carried on to Virginia, and that's where his the person who buys him, then the sea captain buys him in Virginia, and then takes him back to England. Chapter 3, his wander at a fall of snow. He's never seen snow before. It's really funny, the description that he gives of this. So he has a number of lighthearted moments, even though this is a pretty heavy work, some lighthearted moments. This is a good example of it. The fall of snow, he's like, wakes up and thinks somebody has poured salt all over the ground, and this is unreal. And so he goes and tells his master, and his master kind of laughs and tells him, go get some and bring it. And he picks it up and it's like, oh my goodness, this is very cold. And so, but this is his first experience of snow, and it's really a great description. Again, it's a moment of humor in what is otherwise a pretty heavy text. One thing, and then chapter 4, we have the engagement between several different ships, the sea captains. He's fighting at sea a lot for his master. fighting against the French primarily. The British and French are fighting a lot during this period. And then in chapter 5, we see him going on to seeing how life is, particularly in the West Indies. He's often in the West Indies. That is a place where he sees exploitation of slaves sort of at its worst in most of what he sees. Chapter 6, he starts to make money, and he, as a slave, he's with his master from England. He's able to make money on the side when he has spare time. And so it's kind of an unusual thing, or it might seem unusual, but the fact is that quite a few slaves were able to do that, even in America, where slavery was generally quite a bit worse than in England. There were slaves who were able to do a little bit of make a little bit of money on the side. And so his idea is he's going to make enough money to buy his freedom, to buy himself, basically. And so this goes on. He goes back to the West Indies several times, and then he has a number of dreams that sort of come true. Some of them are horrible dreams. One of them, of course, he's shipwrecked in the Bahamas, and he at some points gives up on the idea of I'm never going to be free, because I'm never going to get back to England, and there's no way I'll be free here in the West Indies because there's no free blacks down here. And so he gets there's a bit of despair in him for a while, but then he does return after all, and there's a conversion narrative in chapter 10. There's this kind of earlier conversion when he's baptized that's way up in chapter 3, but in chapter 10 he has sort of like another conversion that he calls a deeper conversion. And then in chapter 11, he is free at this point. He has bought his own freedom, and he's returning to see, he's recognizing the dire situation of others as well. And at the end, he ends with sort of his conclusions about slavery and his hope that slavery is not going to be there forever. So it's kind of a long sort of foray through the autobiography, but I wanted us to kind of get the picture of the whole sort of at one glance. By the way, if you have questions as I'm going, don't hesitate to let me know, but otherwise I'll just keep going. Chapter 1, I wanted to bring this in. So here's the first quote I have from the book. So he says, when they come among Europeans, they are ignorant of their language. This is the Africans. Their language, religion, manners, and customs. Are any pains made to teach them these? Are they treated as men? Does not slavery itself depress the mind and extinguish all its fire in every noble sentiment? But above all, what advantages do not a refined people possess over those who are rude and uncultivated? Let the polished and haughty European recollect that his ancestors were once like the Africans, uncivilized and even barbarous. Did nature make them inferior to their sons? And should they too have been made slaves? Every rational mind answers no. And so you can kind of see in this very first chapter, he's setting this up as this book is an autobiography, but it's also an argument against slavery. And so that's sort of in the beginning. And it's also sort of asking what kind of civilization enslaves other people in quite the way that is happening here. But I wanted to mention the Kingdom of Benin because until 1897, it was actually quite a city. It's a civilization of its own. And in 1897, the British Army actually burned down and destroyed most of the city. It was a huge city, as you can see from some of the illustrations that were made of it right about the time it was destroyed. So up until 1897, it was still recognized as a major African city, really made by them themselves, not sort of a Western city in Africa, but an African city. And so, again, I just wanted to bring this up because it kind of helps to show that, okay, wait a minute, that narrative of civilization versus savagery that sometimes was rampant really during this time and was often given as an excuse for empire building is sort of shown not to be true by the fact that they actually had a city here. And they had a civilization before it was destroyed by British soldiers. But this first chapter, he talks about being born into the Ibo culture, and this is the specific people group that he was part of, the Ibo culture. And then again, he's kidnapped and taken as slaves. He mentions being taken over the wall, and you can kind of see through in the top picture here, through the middle, there's those walls there. And the city was divided up into quadrants, and you could get easily from one part of the city if you went across the wall and walked over, but then the walls would be closed at nighttime. And so during the day when his parents were out, some people got over the wall and stole them. Sort of what you hear happening in places where they steal child soldiers from other countries to this day. And then he's sold to the white men, and he can't figure out quite how they treat him, because when he was a slave in Africa, he was treated almost as an adopted child sometimes, but what he saw there at the coast was a lot of cruelty and really no sense of their common humanity, which even when he was a slave in Africa, it's like, well, maybe we'll take you as slaves next time as conquerors of the tribe that had conquered them. And so that was a different kind of slavery almost that he saw there. Chapter 2 then is a description of one of the first descriptions of the middle passage that we have in writing. And this talks about how crowded the ships were. The middle passage, I'm going to show a diagram a little bit later to show how that passage worked, but it was the trade routes that took people from Europe to Africa to the West Indies and America, to the Americas, really. And so it went back and forth between those three parts. And the middle passage, the passage from Africa to the Americas, was typically where Africans were enslaved and taken across. And so that part of the trade route, a lot of what was taken across was slaves. And so here he describes being on one of these slave ships, and you can kind of feel the claustrophobic feel of it here a little bit. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself and almost suffocated us. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs, into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated. And so dying in your own excrement would be awful, and they had to guard their children against this because there was so little room at the place they were. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror almost inconceivable. And here I have a diagram, a fairly well-known diagram of a slave ship called Brooks. And you can see here how they were basically stacked in there. 130 of them were stowed under the shelves as shown. So they had often a place, actually, yeah, it does say down here, often only a height of 2 feet 7 inches between the beams and far less under the beams. So they had that, so that you couldn't stand up in there. You had to basically lie down because it was so tightly packed. And again, there's the necessary tubs, as he calls them, for them to use as their bathroom, and of course the stench of the place of these bodies packed in so tightly with unsanitary conditions. It was a horrifying situation. So he talks about the fact that he was often taken above because he was sick. He got seasick pretty easily, and so he was often taken above. And he was very grateful that he was seasick because up there he got fresh air as compared to being down in the hold here. But again, this is an early description of the middle passage. I'm going to skip over a few of this. I want to show again, here's the trade route, the triangular trade route that I talked about a little bit. But from Europe to Africa, you'd often have manufactured goods being transported down there. And then enslaved Africans being brought across the Caribbean islands is where the West Indies would be, and then over to the colonies. And then raw materials brought from the Americas over to England. And so that whole route would be part of it. And for Equiano, he's taken first from Africa to the Caribbean and then on over to Virginia, and then taken back to England with his the man who bought him, and then he goes for his master, not so much to Africa again, but rather straight from England to the Caribbean. But this is kind of the overall trade route that was happening during this time, and he describes it in one of the first descriptions we have of sort of the trade route from the perspective of someone who is enslaved. And certainly the first description that we know of the Middle Passage being brought from Africa to the Americas. In chapter 3, so in the first couple chapters, there's a lot of despair, as you can imagine. Chapter 3, that starts to change a little bit. His tone changes a bit. And here he talks about his master and Dick, a young man that he befriends, actually, and says, this young man, Dick Richard is his full name, but he usually just goes by Dick. And he says, this is the first one that I saw, a first white boy that I saw rise above his prejudices. And so in that, he's saying that they sort of became friends in some way. But he sees Dick and his master reading a lot, and he says, I had a great curiosity to talk to the books as I thought they did, and so to learn how all things had a beginning. And for that purpose, I have often taken up a book and have talked to it and then put my ears to it when alone in hopes that it would answer me. And I have been very much concerned when I found it remained silent. So he was assuming they were able to actually talk to the books, not realizing, oh, they're reading what's on the page, but thinking they're actually talking to it. But it's his first sort of fascination of what is a book? How does it work? What's going on with that? And then we'll see books in a few later chapters here become very important to him as well. But in chapter 4, the whites don't see him as people, but he really doesn't quite see them as people at first either. He thinks of them more as ghosts. They have such pale complexions. He's not sure what to think of them. But he says in chapter 4, he starts, not only does he feel quite easy with his new countrymen, but he relished their society and manners. I no longer looked upon them as spirits, but as men superior to us. And therefore I had the stronger desire to resemble them, to imbibe their spirit, and to imitate their manners. I therefore embraced every occasion of improvement, and every new thing that I observed, I treasured up in my memory. And so here it's kind of like his view of them has shifted to from thinking they're ghosts to thinking they're some kind of superior humans, but he's not quite sure what that means or how it comes that they're superior. And he goes on to say later that he supposes them superior because they have the power to take him captive. And so that's what makes him think. He's not really sure how that has come about, but the trade between the African slaveholders and the European slaveholders. He's not really sure how that's come about, but he imagines that because they're selling to the Europeans, that the Europeans have the upper hand. So he's really trying to figure out what makes them superior in these ways. But there's another friend here who becomes like a father to him on the ship. Daniel Queen is this man's name. And he says this about Daniel Queen. He taught me to shave and dress hair a little, and also to read in the Bible, explaining many passages to me, which I did not comprehend. I was wonderfully surprised to see the laws and rules of my own country written almost exactly here, a circumstance which I believe tended to impress our manners and customs more deeply on my memory. And so Equiano here is basically saying when he reads this, he sees in the Bible some of the laws and rules of his own country, particularly in the Jewish laws. And one of the things that he doesn't realize at the time, I think he does realize it later, is that there were Jews who lived down, particularly in Ethiopia, but also in the kingdom of Benin. There were actually Jewish influence, and Judaism was part of the background of the culture that built some of these cities, and that's something that he didn't realize at the time, and it's something that a lot of people haven't known. But throughout this book, it's interesting that he kind of looks at Israel's story and his own story, and says, oh, there's several parallels here. But again, later he finds out that there was actually Jewish influence over the formation of the kingdom of Benin as well as the kingdom of Ethiopia. If you know at all, if you've seen Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know that in there there's the legend that the Ark of the Covenant, the Jewish Ark of the Covenant, was taken down to Ethiopia, and so that's part of what the legend is. But whatever the truth or falsehood of the legend is, there is certainly a sense of Jewish influence in that area, and there certainly were for a while Jews who lived in that area, as well as people from that area who were followers of Judaism as well. So it's kind of an interesting, forgotten piece of history that he didn't become aware of until after he wrote this book. But he's still tapping into it, even though he wasn't really aware of it when he wrote it. Chapter 5, actually, chapter 5 and 6, he talks about the horrors of the West Indies, and I'm going to just read a little bit of this. At the sight of this land of bondage, a fresh horror ran through all my frame and chilled me to the heart. Surely this traffic cannot be good, which spreads like a pestilence and taints what it touches, which violates that first natural right of mankind, equality and independency, and gives one man a dominion over his fellows, which God could never intend. You can almost hear the language that then becomes part of the Bill of, not the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, sort of in the background of this. The idea of the natural rights of man is in here. And that was an idea that was really being talked about during the Enlightenment, during this period that Equiano is writing, actually. And so it's kind of clear that he is actually tapping into the conversations going on in intellectual circles of his period. And I'm going to skip most of the rest of this, except the second quote, the beginning of the second quote here. I was from early years a predestinarian, and I thought whatever fate had determined must ever come to pass. It's really interesting. He talks about it more in terms of fate at first, but later he talks more about providence. Fate, like battling against your fate, is untenable. You can't actually battle against your fate, is sort of how he describes it at first. Later he talks about it in terms of providence, and like God is in charge of everything. So rather than fate sort of controlling everything, blind fate, as if you will, sort of a little more of a pagan concept. He has the concept of providence, of God actually being in charge of everything. And so when things don't go well, he starts questioning, have I done something to upset providence? And so it's really interesting to see those kinds of questions starting to pop up. All of that kind of happens before his later conversion event, which we'll talk about a little bit later. I wanted to give us a little bit of a picture of how this looks. So this is a picture from, I'm not sure which of the Caribbean islands, but one of the Caribbean islands, an artist who was down there took this picture, painted this picture of the African slaves at work in the Caribbean islands, cutting sugarcane. That was one of the main industries down there. And as you can see, you see the imbalance of power. Those on horses have power over those who are not on horses. The English and other European nations who are down there have power over the Africans and also the natives of the islands. And so this is really something that shows up, and that he in this painting, you don't actually have depictions of some of the horrors that he saw down there. People being whipped to death for the smallest things, people being whipped if they refuse to eat, and people being whipped if they didn't gather enough sugar cane in a day, if they didn't gather enough sugar from the sugar cane in a day. And the cruelty of the whippings really impressed him, especially because this is a really humid place where the heat got to everybody pretty quickly. And so he finds this, he describes it in almost hellish terms at times, what he witnesses here. this looks pretty placid compared to how he usually described it, but you do kind of see the fields and hills of sugarcane right on in the islands here. Chapters 7 and 8 then talks about him working for the slave traders. Even after he gains his freedom, it's what he knows to do, how to do, and they beg him to, even the kind master, the Quaker that bought him at the end, and that he bought his freedom from. Then even he was begging him to stay with them. You're my best worker I've ever had. He was saying all those kinds of things, but he ended up working for these slave traders, not the cruel ones, but the ones they found least cruel, working for them for a while. But for sake of time, I'm going to skip over this. I want to look, though, at this next one. In chapter 9, he actually was given a certificate of good behavior. He asked this of one of his former masters. It may have been his, I don't think it was this last one. I think it was this next to last one. And he asked for this certificate so that he could go around with the certificate and get better jobs, basically, with the certificate. So if you notice here, Montserrat, which is one of the Caribbean islands there, in one of the Caribbean islands, so he has the date, and then it just reads, the bearer hereof, Gustavus Vasa, notice that's his the name his slave owner had given him, was my slave for upwards of 3 years, during which he has always behaved himself well and discharged his duty with honesty and assiduity. Robert King, to whom all this may concern. And so he talks about getting this certificate of good behavior, which really helped him to succeed and get better jobs and be treated more fairly, still somewhat unfairly, but more fairly than he was before he had the certificate. It's kind of interesting that he's learning how to play by the rules of a society that has oppressed him. It's really interesting how he does that. Chapters 10 and 11, then 10 is the conversion experience. If you've ever read Jonathan Edwards or other conversion narratives, you'll notice the similar language here. So he says, in this deep consternation, so he's thinking, he almost is killed at one point, and he's thinking, wait a minute, if I had been killed, would I have been ready for eternity? And he says this, in this deep consternation, the Lord was pleased to break in upon my soul with his bright beams of heavenly light, and in an instant, as it were, removing the veil and letting light into a dark place. And so both Jonathan Edwards and John Wesley, if you've read their conversion narratives, you have that same sense of the warmth and the light coming into a dark soul that all of them had. And now Equiano is reporting the same thing. And so interesting to see if you've ever looked at this genre of conversion narratives, the similarities that run through there. But then there's a sort of lightness at the end after this conversion narrative that wasn't there earlier. He's also working with Wilberforce by this point. It doesn't actually say it in his novel, or in his novel. This is not a novel. In his autobiography, it does not say that he was. But from what we know of his life, we know this was about the time that he started working with Wilberforce. And John Newton also started working with him, working for the abolition of the slave trade. John Newton, of course, is a former slaver himself, had a slave ship, had his own conversion narrative, and then later was like, wait a minute, slavery is wrong, really, really wrong. And so he joins with the cause of abolition with Wilberforce. He's really the one who pushes it through Parliament. In chapter 12, then, we have, at the end of this, I hope to have the satisfaction of seeing the renovation of liberty and justice resting on the British government. And here he kind of breaks the fourth wall of literature, as they sometimes say, and he talks directly to the reader. So I have and so he's looking at his readers, particularly his English readers, his British readers, and saying, I hope to have the satisfaction of seeing the renovation of liberty and justice resting on the British government to vindicate the honor of our common nature. So again, insisting on the common nature of Africans and the British. We're both humans. He talks about also earlier about a verse from scripture which says that we're all of one blood. All nations are of one blood. And so he uses that also in his narrative. But then here he says, in a word, it lays out open his narrative, lays open an endless field of commerce to the British manufacturers and merchant adventurers. And says, if you were to get rid of slavery, you could, the commerce that you have in the West Indies and the Americas would actually get better, not worse, because people who are motivated to work for money or for their own good welfare rather than just for a master are going to do better. And so that's part of his argument here. And then he says the abolition of slavery would be in reality a universal good for people who are thinking about making money, and that's part of who his audience is here, but also for people who are thinking about the morality, or rather the immorality of slavery as it was being practiced here. So this kind of draws it to an end. And then he actually, in the very end, he says this: I am far from the vanity of thinking there's any merit in this narrative. I hope censure will be suspended when it is considered that it was written by one who is as unwilling as unable to adorn the plainness of truth by the coloring of imagination. So here again, he's insisting, I did not add anything. I didn't color this in with my imagination to make a great novel. Instead, I gave you the plainness of truth about my situation. What makes any event important, he says, unless by its observation, what makes any event important, he's asking, unless by its observation we become better and wiser and learn to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before God. And there again, he's putting in a scriptural quotation for his audience here. To those who are possessed of this spirit, there is scarcely any book or incident so trifling, or incident so trifling that it does not afford us some profit, while to others the experience of ages seems of no use, and even to pour out to them the treasures of wisdom is throwing the jewels of inspiration away. And so basically he's saying this whole experience that he's had and that he's talked about, and slavery and the situation of slavery that he's drawn attention to, he says, for those who actually want to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly before God, to that kind of person, this story is going to be effective because it's going to be of use to people who want to better their lives and their way of life. And to really do all the things he said. And so that's really how he's hooking his argument against slavery with scriptural texts and with sort of his own experience, both of those. I have just here at the end a list of questions that come out of his text, questions that he's raising basically. And if anyone wants to ask more of these questions, we can look at some of them a little bit more. But mostly I just want to go down through here and think about what are the issues that he raises here. So one of them, how does African culture compare to European culture? And I think him pointing out that he was from the kingdom of Benin is not just a lighthearted comment. In a sense, there was a civilization there already. They had a culture there. And then also, how does it compare to Jewish culture? And then how is African slavery different from European slavery? And I talked about that a little bit in the beginning, how yes, there was slavery in Africa, but it was more like taking neighboring tribes as captives, almost adopting them into your family sometimes, or maybe being turned into slaves by them when they win a war or something like that. And so the difference between the different types of slavery is something that's emphasized at the beginning of his narrative here. What is civilization? I kind of talked about this before, but how does empire building blind people's eyes? And that's one of the things, the building of the British Empire and the ways of spreading their empire across the world is part of what he critiques as he goes through here and thinks about their presence in the West Indies, their presence in the Americas, their presence in other places around the world as well. India is another place that he mentions. He doesn't actually travel there himself, but he's aware that they're also in India. And so he's asking these kinds of questions for them. How do fate or providence play a role in the stories of our lives? And again, I mentioned a little bit that That's one of the issues that he plays with a lot, and his old belief in fate is kind of replaced by belief in providence, which in some ways is more complex than fate. Fate is just inexorably there, whereas providence, he connects with a person, and so it's a different kind of situation, even if providence, like fate, is overall. And so there's a difference. And then the last question, how do our experiences shape our sense of identity, our sense of self? And really during the Enlightenment period, there's a new ideas about self. The self as being autonomous, for example, was not an old concept. It was kind of created, if you will, during the Enlightenment period. And so he's playing with that new idea of what the self is. But mainly he looks at the sense of identity as like, am I Gustavo Vasa, the name that was given to me by my slave when I was a slave to this man, or is it Equiano? Is Equiano my name? And so he stays with the name Equiano, and that's his main name, but he does mention the other one. And so that sense of having almost a doubleness of identity is sort of with him all the way through. His letter to Parliament that he attaches at the beginning, I want to just look at two things from that. In here, he talks about the purpose of his book as a whole, and it is to excite in your august assemblies, this is of Parliament, a sense of compassion for the miseries which the slave trade has entailed on my unfortunate countrymen, actuated by the hope of becoming an instrument toward the relief of his or of my suffering countrymen. He says that's the purpose of this book. And then the second thing, the closing, he almost gives a kind of benediction to his novel. And that is, may the God of heaven inspire your hearts, and again, still talking to Parliament, with peculiar benevolence on that important day when the question of abolition is to be discussed, when thousands, in consequence of your determination, are to look for happiness or misery. So he really lays it at the feet of Parliament here to say, what you do has immense significance for a lot of people. And in some ways, their fate is in your hands. But again, his insistence at the end on providence and of them aligning themselves with the will of providence, rather than just what you do is what's fated to happen, but rather they have to align themselves with providence. Is part of his argument here. So that kind of gives you the overview of the narrative and of Equiano himself. So I want to open it up if there are questions or if you have things you want to talk about further.
That's great. Thank you so much. I have not read this work yet, only excerpts, and I'm so excited to read it in its entirety now. So thank you for the introduction.
Yes, definitely worth reading in its entirety. And there are now in a lot of American literature books, there's excerpts of it. But really, without reading the whole thing, it's kind of like, oh, I only get a piece of it. I mean,
yeah,
pieces of it obviously tonight because of the time, but also the sense for me, it's such a tightly constructed work that if you leave out any one part of it, you risk misreading another part of it. So yeah, reading the whole thing is definitely recommended.
On that note about how kind of well constructed and well written the book is, we have a question in the Q&A asking partly how Equiano learned to read and write so well and when.
Yeah.
Maybe I'd add to that kind of.
Yeah. No, that's good.
Maybe what was he reading other than the Bible, and kind of how did he approach literature generally?
Yeah. Excellent. And so, as you mentioned, he's becoming a little bit acquainted with the Bible when he's on ship with that Daniel, who sort of functions as his father almost. And he actually is called, he calls him father, and the other sailors actually call Daniel his father because they're so close. And he's I don't remember, he's maybe 20 years older than him, something like that. And so there's quite an age difference, but they really jive. So that's the start of it there. But then it really happens in England between his times when he's out out at sea, He is actually able to go to school, and his the teacher is also, I think I mentioned this, his teacher was also his godmother. And so when he got baptized, and so she really helped him to learn to read. So he went to school. His master basically provided for him to go to school when he was not out at sea. And so there were lulls where sometimes it was for, at first, actually, it was a period of 3 years, so quite a while that they were in England, that he was just going to school during those years for the most part. And so that gave him a strong background. And again, it was an experience that not every slave had, particularly in America, in the American colonies. That was a very unusual thing. But even in Britain, it depended a lot on sort of who your master was, whether you had any ability to do that. But in general, his observation, as well as the observation of slaves from America who were then able to go over to England, their observations were that there was much more freedom for slaves, even when they were slaves in England. And certainly after the end of slavery in England, there was much more opportunity for them to become part of society kind of right away in England. And probably the fact that there wasn't a war and the whole country was recalibrating probably had something to do with it, because in the US, of course, you had the Civil War that kind of upended a whole lot of societal structures, created anxiety all around. Whereas here, it's like, okay, one element changes, it doesn't change all of society quite like the Civil War did. I hope that addresses it, but that would be the main thing. And that was his grounding, but then he took books along with him on the voyages as well, after he had learned to read. And so there were some discussions that he'd have with a few others. A lot of the sailors didn't care about reading, but some of them did. And so he'd always find those and spend time with them, even when he was out at sea.
Yeah, that's great. I found the quote, one of the quotes you used where he talks about well, he calls his narrative trifling as if it might be, but then the idea that any reader knows that like there's no
right. Yeah, it's sort of like that modest comment of, what I did, oh, it's not much,
Yeah.
But in a sense, it really is much. And I think that the main reason he is emphasizing that is so that people don't think, oh, you know what, he made up this novel. This isn't really how it is. He wants to make sure they know, no, I'm actually reporting what happened. But I think you're right. There is a sense of sort of that false modesty almost.
Yeah, but also a genuine approach to literature. Like he found
Yes,
the anecdote about the snow,
that's right. Yes, exactly. And there are other little things in there. So it's clear that he knows sort of the shape of a tragedy and of a comedy. And so he has this, in some ways, this is a shape of a tragedy, but it doesn't have a tragic ending.
Yeah.
There's an openness to, what are you going to do, Parliament? You have the power to make this a tragedy or to make it a comedy, to make it a comedy in the old sense of a happy ending, a happily ever after story. And so I think he puts that sort of on Congress, not Congress, on Parliament, to say, okay, how is this going to end? And there's a lot of joy in what he's doing. At the end, he's advocating for better situation for others. He has seen his own situation improve. But in any tragedy, a good writer of tragedy is going to put some moments of comic relief. That's why in Shakespeare you have clown-like characters, for example. And here he does the same thing with those moments of sort of having fun at his own expense of how he discovered snow and that kind of thing. And so I think that's, again, those moments. There are others as well that he has in there, especially the moments of friendship. That's one of the things I probably should have talked about a little bit more, but the friendship between him and the white boy, they have a lot of moments of laughter and joviality between the two of them that really take what otherwise is a tragic work and give us that comic humor, that dark humor sometimes, but often that lighthearted humor to break up the monotony of the tragedy.
Very amazing. There was one quote that we skipped over, but we have a little bit of time now, so I was wondering
Yeah.
if you could read it for us.
Pretty great. Yeah.
About when he, I think it's about him buying his own freedom, which is absurd to
Yeah.
think about buying yourself, but then it looked like a very thoughtful.
Yes, right. And of course he's conflicted by this, the idea of buying his freedom. And here is the common conflict in a lot of slave narratives is that someone will offer to buy their freedom to buy them, or in his case, he's going to buy himself. But the idea it's kind of dehumanizing to say, okay, I'm buying myself, or I'm going to let someone else buy me. And yes, they're buying me to set me free, but still they're buying me. And that really does have a dehumanizing effect. And I think it's a reminder that despite the fact that he can be happy that he's free now, the way he has to go about to do it in this society, that some things are off. This is not how it should be. And so that I think that sense of having to buy himself in order to have freedom, it remains in there as a reminder. Yeah, I got my freedom, but how I had to go about doing it, there's something wrong with society if we have to do this. And so I think that's a poignant sort of paradoxical moment where he's both having joy, but also kind of this deep reservation about what he actually has to do to experience that freedom. Yeah.
It is paradoxical, and it seems like that one of the large questions that any slave narrative, all these autobiographies will always raise is kind of what is freedom? What do we mean by that?
Yeah.
And their
Yes.
question about civilization and the way he's dealing with what does it actually mean to be civilized seems like a related question. We're like,
It
do we?
is. That's right. Yeah, and both him and here his narrative would remind me of Frederick Douglass's narrative, where both of them find mental freedom before they have physical freedom. Both of them, and for both of them, it is through the process of reading that they start to first recognize, oh, I can be mentally not enslaved, even if I am still physically a slave. And it is really the process of being mentally enslaved that allows them then to pursue that, or encourages them, prods them to pursue physical freedom. But I think it is really fascinating in both of their accounts, those the sense that I am free. It has to like the even the wanting to run away to freedom, to escape in some way, that doesn't happen until they get some kind of mental freedom from their masters. And I think Frederick Douglass probably delves into that even more. His slavery was of a worse kind, you might say, if you can, than Equiano's. Although Equiano saw many people being abused in ways that Frederick Douglass had seen as well. But yeah, that's a great observation. But yeah, a number of paradoxes and in the slave narrative genre as a whole.
Yeah. We only have a few minutes, so maybe I'll kind of switch tacks. You gave us that great page of questions that I'm sure anyone watching this recording will be very happy to refer to again after reading the book, or with high school students.
Yeah.
So with the high school students in mind and their parents that are watching your recording or on the call, I was wondering, first of all, if you could give kind of any advice to any high school students as they start looking at colleges and.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So one of the things I think is that right now with African American stories of any kind, there's sort of if you will, a backlash in our country against that kind of narrative. And so I think one of the good questions to ask yourself in a moment like this is to say, okay, wait a minute, what is causing that kind of backlash, or like within ourselves, if we recognize that we have seen racism in our own lives. Where have we seen racism in our own lives? To ask those kinds of questions. Why does it make us uneasy to talk about this? And I think also the other thing is just being honest with, sometimes I don't know what is good to say and what is not good to say. And so for example, the N word shows up in a lot of older literature, even in Equiano's narrative, for example. And in Equiano's narrative, we have it being used as a demeaning word, but he uses it to show kind of like, this is how people use the language. This is how people were using it. And so it was a part of the everyday language. The other thing, though, is the word Negro, Negro, was a term of pride for a lot of African Americans at the beginning of the 20th century. And so even to this day, you have, for example, the Journal of Negro Education is a quarterly published by, I think, Howard University, one of the historically Black colleges and universities. And it's been around since the early 20th century. But historically, that word was considered a term of pride. A lot of African Americans don't use the term anymore because it sounds too close to the other N word, and so a lot of people will just not use that word anymore, even though historically it's a form of pride. So you might still see it written and that kind of thing, but it's not usually going to be used today. So I think just being honest about, okay, I'm not sure which words are considered harmful, which ones are not, and just being honest with that. And then if you're, and finding forums where you can ask those questions of like, okay, how is this word perceived? How is it not? If you're watching this as an African American, you probably have had some of these words said in ways that you're not comfortable with. And being able to sort of be upfront about it and think about, okay, what is it that they're saying? Is it, first of all, are they using it in a way that's historically accurate, and not realizing that even though it's historically accurate, it might not be, feel very hurtful to you presently, and recognizing that some people don't know that can help to open conversations about it rather than to feel like, oh, we just can't talk about this at all. I think for too long, people have been afraid that they'll say something wrong, and so just haven't talked about it. And again, it's sort of like the opposite of what a lot of the slave narratives were intended to do, is open dialogue and to get people talking about it, the abuses, rather than to hide from it. And so, or to just, as in today's world, now we're not perhaps hiding from it in the way that they were, but rather being uncomfortable and uncertain how to talk. So that's one word of advice there. I know it's a long-winded answer to your question, but hopefully it's helpful.
Yeah, that's helpful. This has been fantastic. I did want to reserve just a minute to ask you what your favorite aspects of Toccoa Falls is, or maybe
Oh,
what
yes,
there,
right. Well, you mentioned when you talked about it, the waterfall, and I will say it's magnificent. You walk around the corner, it's not a long walk at all, and it's kind of hidden. You don't even realize that it could be as high as it is until you walk around the corner, and there it is. So I love being able to go there at any time just to enjoy the falls. It's a short walk from my office. I can walk out around the corner and find the waterfalls. And so I love the setting, and the waterfalls, but it's also the whole environment of the campus. You mentioned it's a rural campus, but because of that, we have this beautiful sort of spot of nature that I do some eco-criticism as well. And so look at the environment and literature. And so I love this spot for sort of the outdoorsy feel. So that's one thing. I think another thing is really just the ability to have small classes where we can gather around works of literature and discuss works of literature. I mean, I teach literature, so that's of course what I'm thinking about. But to be able to discuss that in small groups, where on a huge campus, you often have too many people to have those kind of close discussions. So I really like that as well about being here. And the questions of faith and learning and human experience that Equiano was asking are questions that we look at as well on this campus. Yeah, those are some of the things that I appreciate about it.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for bringing us into those conversations tonight. It was really a pleasure. Yeah.
Yes,
thanks.
thank you. I appreciate it very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us, and have a good night. Bye.